Hello, it's your professor, Dr. Sanchez. I'm here to talk to you about politics and the economy. I hope that you're going to enjoy this unit. I think it's a pretty exciting one. I'm going to start out by talking to you about power and authority. And so, when we're thinking about state sanctioned power, the power of the state, of the government, to wield power over people, its citizens, or whether citizens have power over government, it's interesting to kind of stop and ask yourself, well, what is power and authority? How do you define it? And so, power is the ability of one person or group to exercise influence or control over others. Authority is power that's perceived by others as legitimate, and it emerges from the exercise of power that's validated by institutionalized tradition or by procedures. They can be procedures that are based on custom, tradition, or rational legal kind of authorities. Influence is exercise of power that's through process of persuasion. So you are able to get what you want or to enact change or to influence people's behavior through your powers of persuasion. And coercive power or force is achieved through force, that you get what you want because you're able to force people to do things even against their will. And so I'd like you to kind of keep that in mind. Now, when we're thinking about these sociologically, it's important to realize that Max Weber, one of the earlier sociologists I was talking to you about, he was really interested in studying types of authority relations. He really wanted to focus on how do different societies or cultural groups think about how they might want to organize authority. And so he argued that when men or women claim authority and feel they have a legitimate right to expect willing obedience to their command, he wanted to kind of think through what are different ways that people use that rationale. Why should anyone expect obedience, expect compliance, expect that people look at them and think that they legitimately have the right to enact authority over them? And so Max Weber, he liked to think in ideal types, and I think I mentioned that to you before. And so when he was looking at a social phenomenon, he would say, for this social phenomenon, what are the ideal type features of it? Like, or what are the best examples of it? And then he would look at the real world and see if they matched them. And so in his view, there were three types of authority. One was legitimate power, traditional authority, which is legitimate power confirmed by custom and accepted practice. And what he meant by that was this is usually in pre-modern societies, so kind of tribal societies or prehistorical societies, and it's based on the belief in the sanctity of tradition, and that what Max Weber called the eternal yesterday, always kind of being mindful about what's in the past. And so this traditional authority is not generally codified in impersonal rules, but instead it's kind of inhering in people, particular people. And so these people either inherit their authority or they're invested in it by a higher authority. And so traditional authority might be kind of a pope, for example. That traditional authority is that when a pope dies, there's a religious group that selects him through their kind of traditional choices. In a tribal society, you might have a shaman who's given authority to oversee the workings, the spiritual workings of the tribe. And therefore, that person is considered the one who has the right to expect authority, but he is getting it inherited or chosen by some sort of religious scripture. And then there's rational legal authority. And rational legal authority is power based on formally agreed upon and accepted rules, principles, and procedures of conduct established to accomplish goals efficiently. And so I'm hoping that you realize that that's supposed to reflect our modern type of society. And that this is kind of looking at what are the rules that characterize it. So do we set ourselves up in laws, like democratic laws about how we can vote and whether we have a representative or a direct democracy? What are the contract laws that we can set up for ourselves? What are the bureaucratic rules in our various universities? That kind of thing. And so rational legal authority. And then there's charismatic authority. And charismatic authority is power that's made legitimate by a leader's exceptional personal or emotional appeal to his or her followers. And so usually this means that they have an extraordinary virtuosity for their society. That's people look at them and they think that, wow, they're really very interesting because they're extremely religious or spiritual, like a cult leader, for example, or else maybe they're heroic in ethical terms, like a civil rights leader, like a Martin Luther King, or they're profoundly charismatic, like a John F. Kennedy. And they don't necessarily even have to be charismatic in a positive way. And so Hitler, for example, would be considered to be kind of a charismatic authority. They had these exceptional personal or emotional appeal to his followers. And so what Max Weber said is that these three are ideal types, and that in reality you're not going to really find a perfect example of them, that they're often mixed together. And so, for example, in charismatic authority, if you have a cult that's formed, a cult is only going to last unless the leader thinks of how he's going to have it last, is only going to last as long as the cult leader, right? Through his or her lifetime. And so a charismatic leader of a cult is going to have to decide, am I going to create my cult as having traditional authority, meaning that I set up kind of a practice of I get to select who the new cult leader will be, or I develop some sort of kind of accepted practice about how we select one, or am I going to do it kind of through rational legal procedures? Am I going to codify my cult into being something that has pretty standard rules? And so Max Weber would look at that and say, it's interesting to look if we have kind of mixes of them. And so to ask you a controversial question, I'd ask you to step back and think through, is the United States a plain, clean, simple example of rational legal authority, or are we a mix of charismatic authority and rational legal? So that might be an interesting question, especially when you think about our recent elections and people's reactions to previous presidents and our current president. Okay, so now let's look specifically at political systems. Overall, we have authoritarian and democratic systems of governance. And so under authoritarian systems, we have monarchies, oligarchies, dictatorships, and totalitarianism. And with democracy, we have all sorts of different kinds of varieties of democracy. We have participatory democracy, sort of direct democracy, where each vote counts. We have representative democracies, which is like ours, where we elect leaders, and that sometimes we have direct ballot initiatives, but not always. Sometimes we allow legislators and senators to decide for us, representatives and senators. So those are the two major kind of broadest kind of groupings of democracy. And then we have to think about suffrage. Suffrage is the right to vote. Some societies that are really trying to have an advanced democracy have universal suffrage, where they permit everybody to vote. Others have more limited forms of suffrage. And so, for example, in the United States, it wasn't until 1920 that women had the right to vote, and that there was all sorts of laws throughout the mid-20th century and even into the 1960s that disenfranchised minorities from voting. And in fact, we're having a big controversy in the United States about whether we should permit felons, after they've paid their debt to society, whether they should have the right to vote or not. And so we're making progress on that. We're saying that they probably should, but it's still highly contested. And then we have forms of illiberal democracies. And so democracies that have inequalities in who's represented, inequalities in laws, that try to fuss or create barriers to voting, that kind of thing. And so democracy is not always occurring purely in the world, as you all know. And so it's important to kind of think through when democracies become thwarted and what are ways in which people are not participating fully in their societies. And so to look at this more closely, I'm going to talk to you a little bit more about the authoritarian forms of government. And so a monarchy is a form of government headed by a single member of a royal family, as you all know. An oligarchy is a form of government in which a few individuals rule. And so they might be members of the same family, or they might be sets of families who are part of elites. They might be people who are tied to religious choices. And so an oligarchy is a few individuals are ruling. A dictatorship is a government in which one person has nearly total power to make and enforce laws. And that's a little bit different than a totalitarian regime. And so a totalitarian regime involves virtually complete government control and surveillance over all aspects of a society's social and political life. And so an example I have for you is Pakistan. And so I'm going to talk to you about Pervez Musharraf, who was president of Pakistan from 2001 to 2008. And so this man, he started out and he was serving in the military, and he ended up becoming the army chief, the chief of the army. And he also became the chair of the Joint Chiefs of Staff for Pakistan. So he had two very powerful army positions. And so he ended up staging a coup and taking over the government. And so when he did that, he declared that he was president. And so now he's the head of the army, the military, and he's also the army chief of staff. So he's controlling the military and the government. And so then he suspended the Constitution, and he took control over large aspects of the media. So he was controlling the broadcasting of news and what could be printed in newspapers. He suspended the Chief Justice of the Supreme Court in Pakistan, and he appointed another Supreme Court justice that was more in line with his views. He arrested thousands of lawyers, human rights activists, and journalists while he was president. And it's said that he was actively involved with assassinations of people who were trying to bring democracy to Pakistan during this time, including Benazir Bhutto. And so this is an example of totalitarianism. He was trying to grasp control of all kind of major institutions of society: the media, the Supreme Court, the military, the legislative branch of government. Okay, so what are some problems with political systems? Well, there can be corruption, obviously. We know in the United States we're concerned, very concerned with corruption and what we're now calling the swamp, right? Should we drain the swamp in government? And so we're concerned about whether outside interests are donating large sums of money and how much influence those may have. We're interested in whether people who are in our government are obeying special interest groups instead of the people. And we're also interested and concerned about whether there's corruption involved with people who have been lobbyists and have represented major corporations, but now are taking on governmental roles. And then we're also concerned about the misuse of government funds for personal gain. And so when we hear news stories about city mayors using government tax funds to go on vacations, or misuse of funds when political conventions are held. We're also kind of concerned with bureaucracies in government. Do we have too much of bureaucracies, too many divisions who are doing the same thing, too many employees within governments? Is the bureaucracy really helping American citizens, or is it hindering it? And so we're kind of concerned about the growth of government and whether governments should be streamlined. And we're concerned about class, race, and gender inequalities in political systems. There are a lot of sociologists who are arguing now that what with the global migration rates as high as they are, and the politics around citizenship in the world right now, and the number of political refugees there are, that citizenship is becoming a really powerfully important political issue in this world. What is the nature of citizenship? Can you hold dual citizenship? What happens when your children are born in one country as compared to the country that you're in? Is citizenship in one nation more valuable than another? And so political struggles over the nature of citizenship will become really important in the 21st century. Now let's take a moment to kind of look at voter participation. So there's been research that's showing that since like April 2010 and then onwards, that we're starting to see kind of an even split in the United States about how we're thinking of ourselves as political participants. And so 33% of people are registered voters are Democrat, 25% are Republican, and 34% are independent. And so you know this from the last election, that we know that the independents were powerfully important, that people were really concerned with how they might sway. A lot of research suggests that people who say they're independent, they more or less always vote along one particular party line, and that every once in a while may vote the other direction. So they kind of have a favorite way of leaning, whether it's Democrat or Republican, but that they really do consider themselves to be independent. What's really interesting is that millennials, people who were born after 1980, millennials are really different. And so millennials, more than 50% of millennials think of themselves as independents. And so what we're thinking is that in the United States, our political system may be becoming more fractured, that younger and younger people who are growing up into voting age population are more likely to be independent and not necessarily go with the two major parties. I'm sure this is not news to you at all. What probably should be news to you is that our voter turnout as a nation is very low as compared to others. And so in 2008, the voter turnout hit a 40-year high, and that was the third straight presidential election with an increase in voter participation, and that it was very high for young people. And so you know that was for President Obama's election. Same thing with 2012. And then we also know that for the 2016 election, there was an increase in voter participation, and there was also an increase in people who hadn't been voting at all or hadn't voted in recent elections. And so different kinds of pools were being tapped. But that some people who had voted a lot had kind of fell away. And so it's really sort of interesting to kind of look at what gets people to vote out, to turn out for voting. research kind of really shows that overall the U.S. is very low as compared to other countries. And so among 166 countries that hold democratic elections, the U.S. ranked 147th in 2006 and 109th in 2008. And so if you look at this, here's the thing that's showing you a graph that's kind of showing you parliamentary elections since 1945. And so you can see Italy has about 93% of its population that shows up for election. Cambodia, 91%, Australia, 84%, Germany, 81%, and then we are even below Russia. So Russia's at 55% and we're at 48%. Research is really clear that if people don't vote, their voices don't get represented in legislative systems, that the governments become far more routinized in serving their lobbyists. And so it's a concern that there's low voter turnout. You might ask yourself, why are some nations higher than others? Some are really high because the nation kind of makes it easier for people to vote, and so they make it that voting is on a day where there's not any work. They also, some states, they punish people who don't vote. And so you might experience a fine or a fee if you don't vote. Other nations, they pay people a fee if they do vote. And so there's different ways of kind of looking at it. We've chosen that people should feel obliged to vote, and we don't necessarily make it easier for them by, making it a day of voting and not of working, for example. Okay, anyway, I would ask you to kind of consider, why do you think the United States has such low voter turnout? All right, now I'm going to turn to you and talk to you about different models of power. And I definitely want you to understand this for the midterm. So I'm going to talk to you about the power elite model by C. Wright Mills. To do that, I have to first talk to you about Karl Marx, because the power elite model really kind of originates in his ideas. According to Marx, you'll remember he's kind of this major conflict theorist, the dominant or ruling class controls all the major institutions of society. And in fact, the government itself, the state, is simply an instrument by which the ruling class exercises power. Karl Marx felt this way. He felt as though the dominant ideologists, the bourgeoisie who controlled the capitalist factories, they also wanted to control the government and make sure that there was laws that prohibited people from forming unions or prohibited people from asking for women minimum wages or workplace safety rules, that they are also controlling the education institutions. And so he really was writing this kind of model of what do the elites or the capitalists or the bourgeois do. And so C. Wright Mills wanted to pick up on that idea. So he started writing in the 1950s. And in his power elite model, he said that there's a small, very small group of military, industrial, and government leaders who control the fate of the U.S. And in his view, they operate as a self-conscious, cohesive unit. Okay? That they know each other, they collaborate together, they're a conspiracy together, and that he calls it interlocking directorates. So that if you're serving as a government leader, you might also be a military leader. Or if you're an important business person, you might be on the some sort of board of the government. And so an example, not to be controversial, but an example would be Dick Cheney. And so you remember that Dick Cheney was vice president for President Bush. And at the time, he also was on the chief of staffs for the military. And also, he had recently been on the board of trustees for Halliburton, which is a kind of a subsidiary or part of Blackwater. And that Halliburton was getting an enormous number of government-funded grants to serve the military. And so this would be a pure model, like C. Wright Mills would look at Cheney and say, here's somebody who's in all three spheres of these power constructions. And so he's an example of an interlocking directorate. He's in all three spheres. So Domhoff, this other researcher, said that's interesting to think about who's in control of society. But he didn't necessarily think of it as so cohesive, where these small group of people know each other and interact together and serve in these three major institutions of society. Instead, in his model, he talked about it as you can have elites who are part of the corporate community, so like the business world, and you can have elites who are part of policy formation organizations or think tanks, like the Heritage Foundation, or you can have people who are just kind of wealthy, the social upper class. But generally, Domhoff said that if you look at the United States society, this elites are largely white male, and upper class. But that you can kind of see two different coalitions. And so one coalition is corporate conservative. And so business leaders, people heads of Fortune 500 companies, people working on Wall Street, people who are heading up the major banks. And then there's liberal labor, so people who work at universities, people who work for major labor organizations to work for unions, that kind of thing. And he saw those as two big struggling elites struggling in society, U.S. society, for power. If you wanted to see kind of a graph of it, you could look at this way. And so on C. Wright Mills, he's got it as kind of a pyramid where there's not any bleeding between the categories. And so the largest group is the unorganized, exploited masses. So people who are relatively disempowered, whose voices are not heard in the political sphere, who are entirely dependent on what wages are given to them, and don't have a lot of kind of power overall. The next group is interest group leaders and legislators and local opinion leaders. But then at the very top, the smallest group of people are the corporate rich, the executive branch, meaning the government, and military leaders, and that they're all in this group together. Domhoff says, hey, it's more like concentric circles. And so you have a social upper class as one circle, a policy formation organizations, people who are in government or think tanks in another circle, and then the corporate community, so people who are business leaders, CEOs, innovators in that category. And so, for example, let me think. Steve Jobs first started out simply kind of in the corporate community, right? He then kind of moved to that little brown portion of it because he went to corporate community and social upper class. A lot of people argue that he never really ever was interested in legal issues or policy issues. Some people disagree with that. So, for example, he invited President Barack Obama to visit with him, and Mr. Obama went so that he could talk with him about how he thought the U.S. was failing factories, that they were not building enough factories for people to make like Apple products in the United States. And so he was trying to give advice. So if that's the case, he might have ended up in that small purple circle, right? And in fact, Bill Gates is somebody who might be at the center, that Bill Gates is somebody who's a corporate community leader in the social upper class and also is really actively trying to influence policy. He's donating enormous sums of money to try to do research to get rid of HIV/AIDS in Africa, for example. Somebody who's like a Paris Hilton, she might be purely in the social upper class. And so in Domhoff's model, he argues that these circles are really, they can be overlapping. They don't necessarily have to be overlapping, and that people can move across them with some fluidity. There's not one small, tight group of people who all know each other, like in C. Wright Mills' model. Okay, so you should know that. What you also should know for the exam is that C. Wright Mills had a special word for what he called the power elite. He called the people who were at the very top of that pyramid the warlords, those who got to control the fate of the United States. Okay, so now I want to talk to you about the military. So the military is a major institution in the United States, and in fact, we spend more per capita on our military than any other nation in the world. And the military is the largest single employer in the United States. So, it's a major employer. Also, 3.6 million men and women serve in the U.S. military. And so you can have people who are working for the military as contractors, building things, building weapons, but then you also have the people that serve. And so when we look at it, we can see that the military, is an interesting institution because it's becoming increasingly more represented by minorities. And so it's just shy of 1/3 of the military personnel report minority status, and 11.8% report Hispanic ethnicity. Now, what's interesting about that is that as compared to other institutions like the corporate world, high elite CEO companies, the military does have a greater representation of racial and ethnic minorities. And so there's a lot of research that's looking at why is that. And so there's some research that argues that the military was a way for black families to get into the middle class, like during World War II, that it was a real kind of a foothold into the middle class. And there's contemporary research that argues that the military, as an institution, has to treat everyone equally and has to address racism or prejudice when it appears. And so it's an institution in which minorities can maybe receive a little bit more respect. But for whatever reason, it looks like minorities who pass through the military are more likely to marry and more likely to have stable marriages than people who are in racial ethnic communities who are having more difficulty transitioning to stable employment. I don't know why I'm mentioning that. I think that the research on the military and race ethnicity is really interesting. There's a lot going on about it right now. But basically, the military is the largest single employer in the U.S. If you look particularly at women in the military, there's almost 214,000 women who are active duty, and another 119,000 who are in the reserves, and about almost 2 million who are veterans. That women are 15% of active duty personnel. So if you look at how women are distributed across the branches, 19% of the Air Force are women, 14% of the Army, 16% of the Navy, and 16% of the Coast Guard. The Marines, they're less represented. I know if you're paying attention to the news, you know that there's real interest now in thinking through whether women's boot camp training and then elite training should look exactly like men's, or what should the standards be. And so this is an issue that's playing out now, how to have women combat ready and how to have training for women that's as vigorous as training for men. Okay, so now let's kind of step back and think about the economy. So, there's so much to say. So the economy of society is a system by which goods and services are produced, distributed, and consumed. And how the economic structure of a society is organized shapes how work is done and who performs it. Okay? So I want to talk to you a little bit about the Industrial Revolution. The Industrial Revolution kind of started in around the 1750s, accelerated in the 1770s, and certainly accelerated throughout the 19th century, as you all know. And there are some places in the world, in developing countries, where now they're in full-blown Industrial Revolution. So they are doing the Industrial Revolution on steroids. They're making us look like we had a very slow one. So China, for example, in South Asia. The Industrial Revolution is really interesting for 4 major social changes in how humans were living. So the industrialization resulted in the separation of work and family. That's when we started having people leave the family to work in a factory setting for long periods of time. Before this, most family members worked together, and so children would work with the parents on a family farm. Maybe they might send their children, their grown children, away to learn a trade or be an apprentice, but work was done across the generations in the same setting, right? And men and women worked together, husbands and wives. The factory changed that. Another thing that happened is that factories caused an enormous transformation in how we consume energy. You know that this is an issue. We're talking about how much energy we need, what energy sources we have. Are we using too many non-renewable energy resources? Are those energy resources causing pollution that is irrevocably changing our quality of life on Earth? This is all part of the Industrial Revolution, the sudden and alarmingly large, intensive use of energy. This is also a time of specialization, that instead of people working on factory farms or in agricultural settings, making the variety of products they'll need, and then maybe trading products if there's some things they can't make, instead we're finding that more and more people specialize in labor. And so instead of I would make my candles, my clothing, my crops, my tools, now instead I might work in a factory and take wages instead. And in fact, the Industrial Revolution brings us our cash-based economy. Okay, so when we're thinking about economic systems, 2 big branches of economic systems are capitalism and socialism. And again, kind of thinking like Max Weber, there's no pure type, right? So a lot of systems are kind of a mixed one. And so capitalism is a system based on private property with profit-seeking individuals, companies, and corporations who compete in the marketplace. An aggressive form of it is a monopoly capitalism, and that's a control of a market by a single business or business firm. So I don't know if you've seen the movie Aviator with Leonardo DiCaprio, where he's playing Howard Hughes. They were talking about how, Pan Am Airlines was trying to have a monopoly of the airlines market, and Howard Hughes was struggling against there just being one airline to represent all kind of flying in the world, and that he wanted to bring his TWA. Okay, so anyway, socialism. Socialism is an economic system in which the means of production and distribution are collectively owned. And an extreme version of this would be communism, right? And then we have mixed economies. And so that's an economic system that combines elements of both capitalism and socialism. And so generally what you see is that capitalist nations kind of try to regulate economic relations to protect consumers. And so they might regulate dangerous products, products that might, for children, for example, be flammable too easily or might be so small that pieces of them could choke children. So we have consumer protections. We also try to regulate safety, workplace safety, and so we try to set up regulations for if people have to handle dangerous equipment or poisonous toxic chemicals at work. So there's a variety of ways in which we engage our capitalist nation, our capitalist system, through government regulations, right? In 2008, the U.S. really kind of faced a real kind of a turning point in how we are thinking about how we're going to combine capitalism and socialism. This was a moment in time where we decided that some companies were, quote unquote, too big to fail, right? And that we decided that we were really kind of willing to accept kind of government intervention to minimize the negative impacts of economic downturns. And so we were really concerned with what happened with the mortgage crisis and the packaging of those high-risk loans. We were really concerned with perhaps the failing of the auto industry. And so that's a moment where we decided that maybe we should manage or manipulate our capitalist system. And it's still controversial, but that's a moment in which we are really showing our mixed economy or mixed orientation. So something I really think is important for you to realize is that we are facing a changing global economy. And so all economic transitions, including investment, production, management, markets, labor, information, technology, are crossing national borders, and nations are becoming increasingly interdependent. And that multinational corporations are drawing a large share of their revenues from foreign investments and and that they're conducting business across national borders. And so I don't know if you ever read Thomas Friedman's book, The World is Flat. He writes about this. In the book, he talks about, he was ordering a Dell computer. And so he said, I called on the phone and ordered my Dell computer. And within 2 weeks, a computer was shipped to me that had been put together by the handmade products in 30 different nations. Some nations were busy making the memory board, the screen, the case for the computer, different sorts of memory chips, like whatever the features of the computer are. Another nations were putting these products together, and then it was shipped to another warehouse in another nation before it arrived at him. And so we are looking at these more increasingly interdependent relationships we have. We know that some nations are trying to set up tax shelters for major corporations, and we know that some corporations have headquarters around the world. And so, for example, Halliburton, that has a variety of military contracts for us, and also was responsible for kind of providing security for the British Petroleum in the Gulf Coast, they have headquarters in Saudi Arabia. And so we are really interconnected. And so I kind of want to think about that, major corporations. And so, for example, look at Walmart. Walmart is the world's largest corporation. So it has 4,000 U.S. stores and over 2,800 abroad, and it's the world's largest private employer. It has 1.3 million U.S. workers and 1.9 million workers abroad, and that it has its revenues rival the national income of most nations. Okay, so when I mean that, I mean after they pay their bills, after they pay their truckers, after they pay their research and development, after they pay building new stores, after they pay for lost product, after they pay for repairing, after they pay everything, their revenue is it's higher than most nations. And if you looked at their revenue and compared it to nations, it would rank 21st out of the 200 nations on the face of the earth. So that's enormous, right? That's really enormous. It's interesting to think about that. When we think about nation states and their power, what does it mean to have corporations that have as much revenue as nations and that have interconnections around the world? That we're becoming a far more complicated global structure now, that we have to think about politics and the economy together. So now I kind of want to think about your lives. I want to talk to you about economic restructuring. So we know that we are seeing these enormous transformations in the basic structure of work, that our workplaces are being really permanently kind of altered. that we're seeing a real changing composition of the workplace. We're seeing massive deindustrialization, and we're seeing the growth of enhanced technologies. At first, we were seeing kind of the falling apart of a capitalist factory society, but now we're even seeing the falling apart of a service society. And so I want to talk to you about that we're seeing a sudden and really near change in what we think about retail, the kind of retail industries. And so basically what we see is that the economy now is based more on service industries in which the primary business is going to be delivery of services. And so that means that I'm talking to you about largely deindustrialization. And so we're moving from the transition from a goods producing economy to one based on the provision of services. And so goods are still being produced. I still have my iPhone sitting right next to me. I still have my couch that I'm looking at. I'm still using my MacBook Air to make this lecture. We still have products, but it's just taking fewer workers, and especially fewer workers in the US, to make them. Because one, we're using workers internationally, and two, we are getting better and better at automating what we make, right? And so if you looked at the United States at the end of World War II, when we were becoming a global economic superpower, 51% of workers in the United States were employed in manufacturing jobs. But now, nearly 75% of people in the United States are working in the service sector. And that's a problem for a kind of middle-class life because service sector's jobs are less likely to have like pension or good benefit programs. If you look at my own family, you can see this. In my own family, I had an uncle, my Uncle Carlo, who he was a high school dropout, but he ended up working for Chrysler up in Detroit, and he never missed a shift, and he always took every single overtime he could get, and he ended up getting a lot of seniority there, and he worked there his whole life, and though he never even got a high school degree, he was in a unionized job, and so he was able to buy not just a house, but a second house for vacation, and he was able to put one of his two children through college, and the other child went to the military. And so he was able to afford a very good middle class life through this working class job. That's obviously being really undermined in the United States. That what we're seeing now is automation, the replacement of human labor by machines. And so we're trying to figure out how can we replace humans with robotic work. And then we're also thinking about how we can de-skill work. And so that's kind of called the tailorization of the factory floor. That these time and work specialists they look at what tasks are done to create products and they try to break it down to its smallest parts so they can hire people at very low wages to do it or else they can get robots to do it. And so these are two really strong kind of features of what's going on. I've got a reading for you that's going to talk about are we seeing even a shift in some of these service jobs. And so we're seeing things like Amazon and other internet retailers are taking away large numbers of human jobs, right? And so there's some kind of research that's suggesting that people are less likely to want to go and shop at local shops or in malls anymore, and that if they do, they're more likely just to get help with learning about a product and then still order it on the internet anyway. And so we're seeing even a shift away from service kind of jobs. So anyway, one of the ways that we see our labor force changing is through the fact that we're seeing the rise in knowledge work. And so the rise in having to know how technology works, how to be flexible in learning new technologies, how to be ready and available to fluidly take new kinds of technology in the workplace, and that we have to understand that we have to have a more global perspective about work. So that modern workers now are going to be more rootless than they were in the past. So for example, take my cousin. He lives in Detroit, and he started out, he was a milk delivery man. He delivered glass bottles of milk. And then he ended up working for selling automobiles. He worked at an auto store. I don't know what they call it, where you buy your cars. Sorry about that. And he became very successful at it. He knew everything about the product he was selling, about the cars, the types of brand he was doing. And so now, China, he's retired. China flies him over frequently to give advice about how to open their own auto sales stores. And so he's kind of a rootless man who's taking the benefit of this changing economy, right? And so Thomas Friedman talks about that we're seeing a real transformation in the workplace. We're seeing workflow software. So for example, I can work at home and get work done because of email and sharing, like sharing my files with colleagues. Open sourcing ideas, outsourcing work. And so the Dell Computer Company having contracts with other people to produce part of the product. Offshoring work. If the workers in the United States are too expensive, I can offshore the making of my factory work elsewhere. I can supply chain. I can have a whole chain of workers across nations who are making it. And so this is happening, and it's almost on steroids. So we're seeing companies become more and more inventive with the ways they're using technologies and labor forces around the world. Now let's think about unemployment. Unemployment, Karl Marx would say unemployment is a thing that benefits capitalists, right? That having unemployed people means that those who are working are worried that they might be replaced by the unemployed, and so it helps keep wages down. But regardless of whether you're a Marxist, it's interesting to think of types of unemployment. And so there's seasonal unemployment. So, for example, migrant workers who are following crops, they're part of a seasonal cycle. And so they might have periods of unemployment while crops are growing, right? In winter season, they might be unemployed. There could be cyclical unemployment. You're in an industry that has cycles to it, like the fashion industry. And then there could be structural unemployment. So, for example, unemployment because an industry is really falling. So, for example, let's think about the coal industry. And so we know that President Trump has talked about how he's going to restore the coal industry, but there are those who are within the coal industry who are concerned about that because they say that long before Mr. Obama's and other regulations were put in place to try to make coal more clean and reduce the number of jobs, the jobs were falling down anyway, that there had been a long cycle of reducing the number of men and women working in the coal industry as they even became more mechanized, right? As they became more automated. And so when there's structural unemployment and large people are put out of work because the industry is changing, you have to kind of start thinking through, what are you going to do? Are you going to give unemployment compensation for a period of time? Are you going to provide welfare provisions for sustained needs? Are you going to give severance protections? Are you going to try to have retraining packages? And so you should kind of think about that. What's going to be the dialogue about how to reorient people to meet new industries that are opening as other industries are falling apart? Okay, so when we think about the U.S., what group might have the highest unemployment rate? In the U.S., currently it's Native Americans. So currently about half of all Native Americans are unemployed. And what you need to know by that word is that unemployed means that you're wanting to work, that you are looking for work and seeing it. There's another group that are called discouraged workers. And those are people who have been looking for work so long and have feel so shut out that they're no longer working. They're out of the labor force. And so that would be a different statistic to think about. Okay, underemployment. Underemployment is being employed at a skill level that's below what you would expect based on your person's training, experience, or education. It also can be working fewer hours than desired. So, for example, I have students who often tell me, my employer is always having me just work 1 hour less than what it would take before I kick into getting benefits. So that would be an example, like people who are working few hours than they would like. My father once was fired from, he was working for a paper company, a paper mill. And he got fired because the paper company was reorienting and they wanted to close that factory. And it took him a long time, because he was in his 50s, to get reemployed at his current educational experience. And so what happened in the meantime is that he had to take a job as a baker at a grocery store. And so that's an example of underemployment, right? That he's not working at his skill level. Okay, so sociologists like to think about the labor market as kind of a dual or segmented labor market. These are the last few things I'm going to say. So the primary one is jobs with relatively high wages, benefits, stability, good working conditions, opportunities for promotion, job protection, and due process for workers. So if a worker gets harassed, they know exactly who they can go to report, and that they know that procedures will be taken. They know that they'll be told the outcome. They'll participate in the outcome. And so they have due process when they have complaints. The secondary job market is jobs with low wages, few benefits, high turnover, poor working conditions, little opportunity for advancement, no job protection, and arbitrary treatment for workers. So you can be fired at will. without recourse. So when you think about it, you can think about it this way: the primary, secondary, and then the underground or informal economy. These types of jobs that are not reported or regulated by government. And so the primary and secondary labor market have upper and lower tiers. And so for the upper tiers, you have things like, for the primary labor market, physicians and lawyers, professors, engineers, executives, supervisors. In the upper tier of the secondary labor market, you might have waitresses and bartenders and hairdressers, cosmetologists, sales workers, and cashiers. And then for the underground and informal economy, you'd have prostitution, con artists, sweatshop laborers, thieves, drug dealers. And then for the lower tier, you'd have, of the primary labor market, you'd have teachers and librarians and social workers, actors, middle managers, truck drivers. And in the secondary labor market, the lower tier would be cooks and maids and janitors and childcare workers. And so I would like you to kind of think about that. As you're looking and walking through the world, pay attention to those who you think are primary labor market workers and think through how their life might be more secure than people who are in the secondary labor market that you see around you. About how difficult it might be not to have health insurance, not to have steady, secure access to employment, not to have security of employment, not to have due process in the workplace, not to have benefit packages as compared to those that have them. Okay, the next thing I'm going to talk to you about is social class and about the distribution of wealth and income in the US and in the world. You take care.